Good afternoon and welcome to this session of the 1600 Sessions, our ongoing podcast to tell the stories of the White House and its history and to talk to key voices from important perspectives. And today we're honored to have the curator of the White House, Lydia Tedrick, and the assistant curator of the White House, Melissa Nolan, who's with us today. And we're going to talk specifically about a wonderful, actually extraordinary suite of furniture that's in the White House, but also to hear about your roles as in the curator's office in the custody of these extraordinary items that are in the White House. But we want to go back to 1817, and the White House has just been rebuilt after the British fire, and James Hoban, the young Irish architect, and Benjamin Latrobe have worked together to reopen this house. And James and Elizabeth Monroe moved back into the White House. And President Monroe had been our minister to France and brought with him shortly thereafter a treasure trove of French influence, including this wonderful suite by Pierre-Antoine Bélanger. I believe there were 53 pieces in the original suite of furniture. And much of this French influence through the Bélanger suite and other pieces is still in evidence in the White House today. We're coming up on an opportunity to reveal perhaps some work that you've been undertaking with the Bélanger suite, and we'd love to hear about that.
I thought we'd begin by mentioning that there's several elements of the Monroe era that are still in the White House today. If you go through the state floor, you can see some beautiful examples of furnishings. There's a number of gilded bronze pieces that include candelabra that are displayed on the east room mantle, and a clock with a figure of Minerva on it that's in the entrance hall that were made by Philippe Pierre Thomier. In the state dining room sometimes we display a plateau and accompanying baskets made by Daenerys Madeline. There's a number of pieces associated with dining that are still in the White House collection today, including some beautiful silver wine coolers by Odio, some soup tureens by Falconier. There's a French porcelain dessert service that includes several pieces that were designed specifically for official use in the White House. Examples are on display in the China Room today. But nowhere is that influence more strongly felt than in the Blue Room. Primarily with the suite of furniture that you referenced to that's associated strongly with the Blue Room. But there are other objects in display in that room that hark back to the Monroe days in the White House, including some porcelain vases. There's another gilded bronze clock. This one has the figure of the Carthaginian general Hannibal on it. In the center of the room, we have a beautiful circular mahogany table with a marble top that dates back to the Monroe years. And we also display in the Blue Room two busts by Giuseppe Cheracchi of Christopher Columbus and Amerigo Vespucci.
So what is this project that's been underway with the Bélanger furniture?
A number of years ago, like many projects in the White House, it really started with a need in that we noticed that the gilding was wearing. It had been years, probably about 40 to 50 years for most of the pieces since they'd last been gilded. And also the last reupholstery had taken place in 1995. We've had a long-term relationship with some wonderful historic gilding conservators in Baltimore, William Lewin and Davida Kovner, and we asked them to do a survey of the Bélanger furniture to see what we could learn about the original finishes on it and to see if any of the pieces had any surviving examples of original gilding, for example, so we could, learn about what they originally looked like. And so they conducted that survey for us, and that was really kind of what got us started on the project. So that was actually about 12 years ago. So it's been a long time, many years of research, but we couldn't be happier that we're finally about to reveal the pieces. Our goal was to finish enough of the pieces so that we could have a kind of grand reveal and have the room furnished all at once. So we are finally at that point to reveal what we've learned about what the pieces looked like originally, as close as we can.
How closely will it resemble what the Monroes would have known?
Well, we certainly hope it'll be as close as possible. The one major difference from the original suite as it was first brought over from France is that the original upholstery was crimson, was red. And we've known that for years. It was red from about 1817 to 1837 when under President Martin Van Buren, the upholstery textiles were changed to blue. And because we've had a history of 180 years of blue fabrics in the room, we decided we certainly weren't going to upend that and suddenly have a second red room in the house. So that is the one major difference between the suite and the original. But in terms of the color of the gilding, the application of the gilding, and the contrast between burnished and matte surfaces on the gilding, and then in terms of the upholstery, like I said, with the exception of the color, we feel like we have gotten it as good as we can. There's a really fantastically detailed bill of lading that survives from when the American agents in France sent over the furnishings which they'd secured for Monroe and for the White House. And that bill of lading is so detailed that for each piece in the Belanger suite, it describes exactly all of the materials, upholstery materials that went into it. So we know everything from how many pounds of horsehair were in a cushion or pounds of feathers to, that this particular chair form had 4 different borders and they were these different widths. I have to say we were very fortunate to be able to work with a French historic upholstery expert named Xavier Bonnet, who is a upholsterer himself in Paris and was just a fabulous resource for us in helping to understand that original bill of lading, which was in French, to understand the terminology and exactly what some of the information there meant and revealed.
So are you using horsehair in this restoration?
We absolutely are. We are using all of the traditional materials in terms of how the gilding is done. It's done in the traditional way, in the same way it would have been done in 1817. We're using linen and horsehair and the silks and the fabrics that would have been available, and everything is hand-stitched on the upholstery, which is just stunning to me.
So in 1817, would this have been seen as important furniture in France, or would it have just been important in the eyes of the American James Monroe? Was Belanger a known designer in France?
He was in France. He was certainly amongst the top cabinet makers working in Paris. He had gained his master status as a cabinet maker in 1788. So by the time this commission comes around, he'd been working for about 30 years, again, as a full owner of his shop. And so he was certainly well established. And he had worked both for King Louis XVI before the Revolution. He had provided furniture for Napoleon during his reign. And then in 1817, the same year he did the White House Commission, he was named cabinet maker to the king, who then would have been Louis XVIII. So he'd really survived the political turmoil of France. And so yes, he was well recognized. And Russell and Lafarge, who were the American agents who helped secure the furnishings for Monroe, in a letter to Monroe, they describe Belanger as the, quote, first eboniste of Paris. So obviously they were, just explaining to Monroe that they definitely got one of the very best craftspeople in the city to produce the furniture for the White House.
So the Monroes move in and they bring this 53-piece suite of furniture, and at some point it leaves the White House.
Well, unfortunately, by 1860, it was considered out of style, and it was auctioned away, nearly all of it. And it was replaced with another gilded suite of furniture, something that was considered more fashionable, or a Rococo Revival style, that was made by Gottlieb Vollmer, a cabinet maker from Philadelphia. At the time that the Belanger suite was purchased, William Lee, who was the government agent that assisted President Monroe in securing these items while defending the costs that were incurred, said that the articles from France were of the very first quality and so substantial that some of them will last and be handsome, for 20 years or more. So at the time they were auctioned, they've been used for about 42 years, and some that have returned since to the White House, you can add another 50 plus years. So I would say that was money well spent.
Yeah, I would say so. They got their investment. So of the 53 that came into the White House in 1817 or thereafter, they all left during the Buchanan years?
Well, we know of a pier table that remained in the White House.
How many pieces are in the collection today, and how did they come back into the collection?
The White House now owns 10 of the original 53 pieces, so including the pier table, which Lydia mentioned. So that one is the only one which has remained uninterrupted in the White House, and then 9 have returned since 1961. And they've come back in a variety of ways. Some have been donated, some have been purchased. And the majority were collected in the 60s and the 70s. And then there was a long break. But, you know, one of the great things about our job is that when the phone rings, we never quite know what may be or who may be on the other end and what treasure they may have discovered. And back in 2012, we received a call from an auction company, a small one, so one that, you know, wouldn't have caught our attention normally, but there was a gentleman who they were selling his estate, and they had found paperwork amongst his belongings with correspondence with some of our predecessors, Clement Conger and also Bill Allman, and he owned, he believed, one of the original fire screens from the set. That was a form that we had actually never seen before, although we knew from the documentation that there were 2 originally. So indeed, we looked into it and everything looked to be that it was part of the suite. And so we were fortunate enough to buy that at auction. And in that case, it was, you know, the generosity of the White House Historical Association which funded that. So we are extremely grateful that we have the opportunity when things do come up that, you know, that we can count on the Historical Association to support those acquisitions.
Well, thank you, and we're honored to do that as part of our original mission. So, as I recall, that fire screen was some very dilapidated condition, wasn't it? You had to look at it and think, really? It was not very...
It was covered with bronze paint, wasn't it?
It is, and actually, as we speak, that bronze paint is coming off. It's not one of the pieces that we will be revealing as kind of our first stage. It's what we're calling phase 2. It just in that our goal, as I believe I mentioned just briefly, was to replicate essentially the furniture that we've long had in the Blue Room in terms of the arrangement and that. And in the goal to have it revealed as early as possible, we decided that the fire screen could come slightly later.
Well, you have 10 pieces in the collection today of the 53, and there's a chair at the DAR just down the street on 17th Street, and there's one at the Woodrow Wilson House in Northwest Washington. So that brings us to 12. Any idea where the others are or what would have happened to them?
Well, there's actually 2 side chairs at the Adams National Historic Site also. Charles Francis Adams, who was John Quincy Adams' son, purchased 2 side chairs at that 1860 auction. And
because these were sold legally or auctioned legally, they can't just be reclaimed by the White House. Do you think that there are pieces like in great-grandmother's attic somewhere that one day will be revealed and
I like to think so.
We hope so. Yeah. What I would love most to have come up is one of the stools. There were 2 different forms of stools in the original suite. 4 were stools to sit on, in which had like X-shaped stretchers. May have even been folding. We're not quite sure on that, but 4 of those were provided, and then there were 6 footstools provided with the suite that probably would have been used with the sofa. We've never seen what the specific White House Bell and J forms looked like, so.
Well, what's the history of this practice of auctioning furniture? Did that end at some point? And I know that Mrs. Kennedy was instrumental in creating a museum standard for the White House and creating a collection. Things that are assessed into the collection of the White House today stay in that collection, but that wasn't always the case.
I believe the auctions ended during the Theodore Roosevelt presidency. I think 1906 was actually the last one. And I think we were probably also helped by the colonial revival movement. There was a greater interest in the past and in the antiques. But until the Kennedy administration, there was nothing official, no official policy that would protect historic objects. So when Mrs. Kennedy comes in, I mean, she comments initially on how there's so few examples of the past on view, and she expresses an interest in creating a museum quality collection to consist not only of historic objects related to the house, but also important examples of American fine arts and decorative arts. And working with a fine arts committee chaired by Henry Francis DuPont, who was a great collector of Americana, and who turned his house into a wonderful Winterthur museum. She formed an advisory committee that helped state the goals of what the collection should be. They sought donations. They provided advice in terms of the objects that should be acquired and not be acquired. And it became apparent that a professional curator would be needed. So again, with the seeking advice from Mr. DuPont, Lorraine Pierce was selected, and she became the first White House curator. And as curator, she would catalog the collection, do research on the collection, care for the collection, oversee installation of objects, assist donors and decorators in working at the White House. And so that was the origin of our office. But also during the Kennedy administration, they worked with Congress to pass legislation in September of 1961, Public Law 87-286. But it states that White House objects, when declared by the President to be of historic and artistic interest, shall be considered to be inalienable and the property of the White House. So this was the first time there was legal protection for historic objects.
Well, I cannot imagine the White House today without you caring for these objects. So for the first 162 years or so, did anyone care for them?
I guess it was dependent on White House staff to look out for it.
There wasn't, I think, for a long time, a real appreciation or sense that these things should be saved. You know, I think for a long time, the furnishings were considered very utilitarian. Again, Lydia alluded to the colonial revival movement in the United States, and especially after the centennial of 1876, kind of a greater awareness of the importance of, you know, knowing America's past, and that was important. And so there were certainly a number of first ladies soon after that really seemed to take a much greater interest than their predecessors had. One of the first was Caroline Harrison, actually, who took a special interest in the China collection and the tablewares that were in the White House. And there's some wonderful stories of her recruiting the staff to basically, you know, go through the house from attic to basement looking for some of the old pieces.
So was it the auctioning of these items that paid for new furnishings, as they would sell the old to acquire the new? Is that how it would work?
I think initially that was the case.
And were the auctions, they sent to auction houses, or would they have auctions at the White House itself?
No, not at the White House itself, but at auction houses.
Well, Mrs. Kennedy was the inspirational founder of our organization, and we believe saw the need for private resources to help with the collection, and the wonderful relationship you cited with Mr. DuPont. We're going to have a collaboration, a partnership with Winterthur coming up, where we'll do a symposium on decorative arts in the White House, and of course look forward to your expertise in engaging that focus, because there's so many stories like this Belanger story that you can inform and inspire us to know more about. So how do you've got this living house. Here's this place that's the office to the President and his staff and the home to the President and his family, and about 500,000 people trundle through it as guests every year, and then it's a ceremonial stage where official visitors arrive. How do you care for a place like that with all of that activity, with all of these precious objects? What are your days like?
I don't think there is a typical day.
No.
Part of what we do as curators is we work with the staff initially. And we have workshops dealing with proper handling of objects and inform people that are moving metalware, for example, or gilded pieces, the importance of wearing gloves. So every little thing that we can do on the backside to help preserve the collection, we try to do.
But the White House is also a place of urgency, and things happen now. And so I can see in my mind's eye staff rushing in from the West Wing of the old executive office building, and something has to be set up now. And how do you deal with that?
We have an operations crew that's part of the executive residence staff, and they're tasked usually for setting up for those special events. And they all wear gloves, and they've all had training, and they know the proper way to pick up chairs and furniture and so forth.
Well, back to our friend Mr. Belanger and the Belanger Furniture. Tell us about some of the artisans that you've used to restore this project and their expertise and how you found them. I was fortunate the other day you showed me one of the new pieces against one of the older pieces that had not been restored, and it is literally, not to be cliche, night and day. The new is spectacular. The old looked great to me, but beside the new, it is really spectacular and special, and I think to have that as a centerpiece in the Blue Room of the White House collection is something that our entire country should be proud of. It's been a labor of love for many, many years to get there. So tell us a little bit of how did you find these artisans and where is this work done, and a little bit about the mechanics of it.
Sure. Well, we were very fortunate that we actually relied on staff that we'd been working with for years to do this project. We're very fortunate now to have a full-time conservator dedicated to the White House collection named John Courtney. And so John Courtney was a huge part of this process in terms of identifying the need and also helping to work with the craftspeople. And he's had a lot of involvement in terms of creating alternative upholstery for the suite. We talked about the house being a living museum, a place for social events and public events, and so there is a lot of wear and tear on the furnishings. And traditional upholstery can be very damaging over time to the historic pieces in terms of if you use traditional tacking and such, where you're creating lots of little holes along your rails and such. So John has been really innovative over the last, I guess, at least 20 years that he's been with us in introducing ways to have the upholstery processes be less invasive by installing like tacking rails and such in the furniture. So for example, maybe you have to secure that with 2 or 3 screws, but then all of the small individual tacks for the upholstery go into that instead of into the frame, the historic frame of the furniture. So he's been instrumental with that. And we have been working for many years with William Lewin and Davida Kovner of Baltimore, and they are specialists in historic gilding, and they have been working on our painting frames for years. So we hired them, who did that original survey for us, to do the gilding. And for the gilded pieces, they have all been done in their studio in Baltimore. In terms of the upholstery, again, we were able to turn to a trusted upholsterer that we'd worked with for years, also out of Baltimore, named Frank Callista. And there's not a lot of people in the country who know the traditional methods of upholstery that were used back in the early 19th century, but he is one of them, and basically agreed to stop all other work and commit himself to just this project. Most of his work has been done at the conservation lab where John works. Again, John has had a very close relationship with Frank in terms of working out some of the details and that. But so we used, like I said, long-standing trusted partners to do this project.
And they also did some scientific analysis of the gilding on some of the pieces to be able to determine what the original gilding looked like.
We did, dating back to that first survey, which Bill and Davida did for us. They took small microscopic samples of different places on the chairs in an attempt to try to see if we had any original gilding. Unfortunately, a lot of our pieces didn't, but the best surviving gilding, interestingly enough, was on the very first chair, which came back into the collection in 1961, which, as we understand it, there was a lot of publicity about Mrs. Kennedy finding the pier table, which had remained in the White House collection. That publicity led to someone, just as you said, hey, I think I have a chair which matches that, in my attic. And she, named Catherine Boland, contacted the White House and indicated she'd like to donate it. And so that really got
The ball rolling
in terms of the idea of trying to find where the other pieces of the suite had gone and to see whether, the White House could collect enough pieces to put it back in the Blue Room. And that's certainly what Mrs. Kennedy did. But in any case, that chair ended up having the most original gilding on it. Along with the chair that is now at the DAR Museum, which you referenced. The Getty Museum in Los Angeles has, in recent years, developed a process for identifying the exact chemical composition of gold leaf. And so we were able to send some of those samples of the original gilding out to LA, and some of their conservation scientists did the analysis for us and were able to tell us exactly what the composition of the gold leaf was. So in the restoration process, that allowed our gilders to secure gold leaf that was as close as possible to those specifications. And in that way, we know that we're getting the color of the gilding as close to the original as possible. So that was, again, something that achieved through science that is making a tremendous difference in how we're presenting this to the public. And we're really proud of that.
Were you able to determine how many layers of gilding?
It differed for the different chairs because, unfortunately, a lot of the pieces that came into the White House collection had been or were stripped down to the wood, and we lost a lot of that evidence. They'd had separate histories, most of them for over 100 years, and so certainly they'd gone through a lot of different things. That's why I was saying when they were able to match up the early layers, or the earliest layers rather, for those two chairs, that again, in different institutions, that was how we knew we were getting it right, and we were getting back to what was on those, and thus what had been on all of the other chairs that we'd lost the evidence of it, but luckily the fact that we'd been able to reunite it with its original suite mates, we were able to figure it out.
So their pier table was the single piece that remained in the White House all of these years, and what's its story? Why do you think that was not part of the auction? And then what happened to it in its White House years till it was reunited with some of its friends?
I can't explain why it wasn't part of the auction, but if you look at 19th century photographs of the Blue Room, it appears front and center in there, even with the Vollmer furniture. So I think we're just fortunate that we didn't lose it and that it stayed for all those years.
And Mrs. Kennedy heard of it or found it.
She read about it in an article, or saw a photograph of it in an article that was written about the Gilded Suite in 1946. And she asked White House staffers, if by chance that table was still part of the collection. And from Chief Usher J.B. West, she learned that it was, and that it was being stored at our off-site storage facility, which at that time was in Fort Washington, Maryland. So it was brought up for her to see, and was not in great condition. The mirrored glass back panel was broken, and the marble top was missing. But they did, I don't know if you call it restoration or conservation work to it, and it was reinstalled in the Blue Room and stayed there for a number of years until the sofa arrived.
When would that have been?
Well, the sofa came in 1979. Before the fire screen, it was actually our most recent, new acquisition.
And how did you find out about the sofa?
That's a pretty amazing story. I will say it's not the story that some of you might hear if you go on public tour at the White House. I have to mention this just because it's my absolute favorite, false story that I've heard. The story got out that it had been found in a Ford dealership. I was in the room one day and I was thinking, so actually I love that sofa. I always think of that sofa, like sitting on that sofa while I wait for my oil to be changed. But that's actually not how it worked. It was somehow acquired by Henry Ford. And it was part of his museum outside of Detroit, Greenfield Village, I believe. And it was a curator who noticed from, again, the press and publicity regarding the Belanger suite returning to the Blue Room, who at some point put together that, hey, this sofa looks really similar. So it didn't have a White House provenance or history when it was in that collection. So it was really, that curator's sharp eye that thought, hey, I wonder if this is related, and contacted the White House. And then later, the Edison Institute technically donated the sofa to us. There were 2 sofas originally, and there was 18 armchairs, 18 side chairs in that original suite that Belanger provided, along with 2 chairs, which we call bergères, which have enclosed sides. So again, a total of 38 chairs.
Goodness.
It was a lot of furniture. But one thing which challenges us now is that there are more doorways in the Blue Room than there were when the suite was used in there. So originally the pier table was located directly across the room from the mantel in the room. So it was on the west side of the room, and then it was flanked by a sofa on either side. Well, if we tried to do that today, the sofas would end up blocking the doors to the Red Room. So it has been a little bit of a challenge in that, for example, that's why we haven't had the pier table recently in the Blue Room, even though we know that was its original location, was because we have the sofa centered on the wall between those 2 doorways. So not that we wouldn't want another sofa, we'd figure out what to do with it, but it would certainly provide a challenge in terms of we don't have the same wall space and configuration that we originally did.
And is the sofa curved to match the curvature of the wall?
It is, and it's 9 feet long.
9 feet long, and that's probably the most amazing thing is that when they, brought that sofa into the room in the late 70s and realized it fits.
Wow, puzzle piece.
And
Yeah.
I tell you, they tried to put all the different pieces of furniture in the room. They moved the sofa into the south window to see if it would work, and ended up going to the configuration that we have there today. So at least the pier table's still on site and has a grand presence in the entrance hall.
Yes. Do the shipping records indicate what Monroe would have paid for the full suite at the time?
It does. He got in quite a bit of trouble with Congress. The original appropriation that he was given to refurbish the house from scratch, following the burning, was approximately $20,000. He spent almost that on just the French furnishings, which he purchased, and those were only for what's now the Blue Room and the State Dining Room. So he had a lot of other rooms in the house to furnish, and so he had to go back to Congress and ask for additional money, because at that point all the entire budget for White House furnishings was provided by Congress. And certainly it was a struggle. That's a continual theme of our history, is presidents struggling to furnish the house in the way that they think is, best and fashionable with the money that they receive in the appropriation. So part of the quote, which Lydia read from William Lee defending, the fact that this furniture will last for 20 years, it was part of the defense of the cost of the suite or of the French furnishings in general, not just that suite. He came under a lot of fire for that.
Wow. So where in the White House is the curator's office, and how many people are on your team? What do they do?
Well, our office is located in what was at one time part of the White House kitchen. So we're on the ground floor in the center of the north section. And I guess the kitchen in the mid 1800s moved to the northeast section. So that area was used for storage and as a boiler room for a number of years. But there are 5 people on our team now.
And outside your offices, there's a reminder of a very important episode in White House history. Tell us about that.
During the restoration or the removal of the paint from the sandstone, there's an area outside of our office. It's protected now. It's under the north portico, but it would have originally been the entrance to the kitchen. And the paint was removed there, and they found burn marks there. And since that area is protected, they decided not to repaint it. So you can see that
It's
evidence
a very sacred
today.
thing to me when you walk by it and you see that as a reminder of that key part in our nation's history. When President Macron from France was recently here, wasn't he given a piece of the Belanger upholstery as a gift from the President and First Lady?
He was. Since we're in the process of removing the former upholstery, yes, one of the back medallions that was used on one of our armchairs was presented to President Macron as a special gift.
Very special, very special. Well, this is like putting a parent on the spot and asking them to tell us about which is their favorite child. But I'm going to ask you, of all the objects in the collection, what are a couple of your very favorite or most meaningful objects to you?
Well, I'm kind of partial to the fine arts collection, but I think one of the paintings that has a lot of meaning for me is one of George Washington that was painted by Charles Willson Peale. It's on view in the cabinet room today and was painted by Peale in 1776 following the siege of Boston. And so you see General Washington standing there with the city of Boston behind him. And that's one that means a lot
That's
to me.
beautiful on the south wall of the cabinet room, I believe, at the end of the table. It's a beautiful painting. What about you, Melissa? I know it's a hard question to pose.
It is. I could probably tell you my favorite child, but easier than my favorite piece in the collection. I mean, of course, the Belanger suite now has a very special place in my heart. But in terms of other original White House pieces, I really love the furniture which was commissioned locally in Georgetown for the East Room, actually by President Monroe. There was a suite of 24 chairs which were purchased from Georgetown cabinet maker William King, and which were originally used, or were intended for use in the East Room. It's kind of a convoluted story because I talked about the money issues Monroe ran into, and the East Room had not been furnished before the burning, and Monroe certainly intended on finishing that room after the fire, but he ran into the same issues with not being able to secure enough money to do it in a way that would have been considered proper in terms of wall-to-wall carpeting and full window hangings. And it's a big room. I mean, it takes a lot of material, right, to furnish. So in any case, he went ahead and purchased this suite of furniture from King with the 24 chairs and 4 matching sofas. And apparently it remained unupholstered until Jackson, 11 years later. They're not gilded wood, but they're reminiscent in a way of the Belanger suite. And we think that may have been inspired by the Belanger suite. So even, American made and mahogany, natural wood finish instead of gilded wood, but they're beautiful, sturdy chairs, and we have 3 of the original 24 that have been, again, reacquired for the White House, because those were also all things that left as part of those 19th century auctions, and I really love those. We have 2 of those right now in the library in the White House, right in front of the mantle.
Yes, I can picture them.
Yeah.
Yes. Is it true that the Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington in the East Room is the only item in the collection today that was in the house when John and Abigail Adams moved in 1800?
That's correct.
Which is really extraordinary in itself to think about.
It was the first painting in our collection, and for many years was the only painting in our collection.
And how many paintings would be in the collection today?
I think fine arts now numbers close to about 600 objects.
Well, and you still acquire.
We do, upon the advice of our advisory committee, the Committee for the Preservation of the White House. We do.
And so to have a work in the White House collection, the artist would be deceased and the work would be of some age, is that correct?
Yeah, with the exception of commissioned presidential and First Lady portraits.
Well, thank you both. The work that you do is an incredible service to the people of our country and to the People's House, the White House, and it's our pleasure and privilege to work with you, to support your work with the objects you've talked about today, but you're also extremely helpful with our publications and fact-checking things for us and helping us to provide tools and resources for education about the house that we all love so much and that you care for so specially. There may not be a lot known about your office, but it's very important to the sustainability of that place from president to president and from generation to generation to keep it to be the very best, as Mrs. Kennedy would have said, the very best representing of American furniture and decorative arts and artisans. So thank you very much for all that you do for our country and for the White House and for the time today.
Well, thank you, because without your support, our job would be a lot tougher than it is. So we're very grateful to have the White House Historical Association as partners.
Well, it's an amazing thing that Mrs. Kennedy, at the age of 32 years old or so, had the foresight and wisdom to know that down the road this would still be needed. And so we view ourselves in an important way a part of her living legacy in historic preservation in the White House. And it's a great team that we have working together. So thank you again and for your time today. And I think our listeners are really going to be interested in hearing what you shared and in seeing that beautiful restored Belanger suite back in the Blue Room. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.